Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning in partnership with the Harvard Alumni Association. I'm pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, Dr. Rachel Meyer. Without further ado, Rachel, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I first just want to thank the Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning for inviting me for this talk. We'll start with what is gig work? When we think of gig work, we often think of relatively recent historical developments and the platform economy. That is, we think about tech companies where workers log onto platforms and take on work by the job. The iconic example in our minds is ride-hailing services, such as Uber and Lyft. We also think about things like DoorDash and Instacart. In this talk today, we're going to zoom out a bit from this one very specific example of gig work and think about it more broadly. We'll be exploring the features of gig work and what kinds of workers are engaged in gig labor. Along the way, we'll touch on some of the larger context of gig work and how workers feel about it. The main feature of gig work is that workers are paid by the job or task. It has a kind of one-off quality to it. Think of the iconic gig worker, the musician, who has a gig where it is just one night, one show. So in terms of the structure of gig labor, the most fundamental aspect of it is being paid by the job. But one of the overarching questions in this talk is, how do workers experience this? Now, taking just this one main feature, being paid by the job, we can already start to see what is so interesting about gig work when looking at it from the perspective of workers' experience, because gig work has a kind of dual nature to it. On the one hand, it potentially offers an immense amount of control for workers, because each and every time a job or gig is offered, workers can decide whether or not to take it. They can accept or reject the gig. On the other hand, the fact that workers are never quite sure when a job is coming next or what future paychecks are going to look like, this can lead workers to feeling quite insecure and out of control. So this kind of dual quality, or even paradoxical or contradictory quality of gig work, leads to a lot of questions about how workers experience it and its consequences. It's important to note that being paid by the job is not at all a new phenomenon. This is where the association of gig with primarily app-based platform services is misleading. Instead, gig work is a long-standing historical practice. That practice is called the piece rate system. And this is essentially defined in exactly the same way that gig work is defined, that is, being paid by the job. The term piece rate comes from workers being paid per item or piece for what they produce. In contemporary gig work, we often think of platforms for service workers, delivering food or groceries or rides. However, historically, piece rate work has often been associated with manufacturing and production of goods, such as garment workers being paid per item sewed, often out of their own homes. Historically, the piece rate system was typical of workers who were poor and marginalized, and thus who generally lack control over the circumstances of their labor. One key question is, do gig workers now look much different from workers who have been engaged in piece rate manufacturing historically, or no? There are two different, somewhat opposing answers to this. One argument, and this is put forward in Ravenel's book, Hustle and Gig, is that gig work in the contemporary economy looks quite a lot like historical versions of piece rate work and other forms of oppressed labor. The argument is that there has been an erosion of protections for workers in recent decades, such that with gig work in the contemporary era, things have gone backwards when it comes to protections for workers. There are two components to this erosion of protections. One is the erosion of protections in labor law in terms of legal changes and also enforcement. and the other is the declining role of labor unions. From this perspective, there is quite a bit of continuity with historical piece rate systems and with workers who labored before the advent of legal protections for workers. On the other hand, gig work has expanded over time among professionals and workers with a higher socioeconomic status. From this vantage point, piece rate work has shifted so that the kinds of workers who are working by the job look quite different nowadays. With respect to gig work in the professional realm, it's worth noting that in terms of the platform economy, although many of us associate it with working class jobs such as drivers, the platform economy is also available to highly skilled and professional workers through apps such as Upwork and Fiverr. Professionals in these kinds of arrangements are often not called gig workers, perhaps simply because the term has some overtones that would take away from professional status. Gig work almost sounds too degraded for highly skilled workers. They're often called freelancers or independent contractors, but structurally, it's gig work. In any case, the alternative argument here goes that these workers have the kinds of skills and resources that would mean they have very little in common with marginalized workers under historical piece rate systems. We're going to be thinking of these two perspectives as we move through the talk today. But to begin with, I can say that both are true to some extent, or in particular ways. It is true that labor protections have been eroded for all gig workers. It is also true that workers with more skills and resources are better able to protect themselves in that context. I want to speak a bit more about the historical context and how gig work has changed over time with respect to how many workers are engaged in gig work and who is doing it. To begin with, the number of workers engaged in gig work as a percentage of the labor force is not large. So, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, as of 2023, 7.4% of those employed were categorized as independent contractors. Now, this is somewhat of an undercount since there are a wide variety of gig-like employment relationships and similar kinds of arrangements. For example, even within the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there's a separate category for contingent jobs. Some surveys have categories for self-employment. Suffice it to say, there are a variety of kinds of work involved and a variety of kinds of measures, and it is a bit hard to quantify, but it is still a relatively small percentage of the labor force. However, it's also the case that it has been growing steadily and that gig work has been making encroachments into new arenas and occupations. We see here, for example, a graph using BLS statistics showing the increase in independent contracting from 1995 to 2023. Additionally, there's expectations that this category of labor will increase due to what are viewed as benefits by both employers and workers. So from employers' perspective, contractors are seen as cost effective. And from workers' perspective, contract work is seen as offering some much desired flexibility. Also, later on, we'll be talking about the ways in which the conditions of gig labor are akin to the conditions faced by other kinds of workers. So the number of independent contractors is only part of the picture. So it's one thing to know that the numbers are increasing, but then the question is, what kinds of work are these folks doing? And this gets to the question of who we think of when we think of gig work. So, in addition to some of the working class platform-based jobs that we've mentioned, there are some occupations that have long-standing traditions of gig work, such as musicians or freelance journalists or photographers. But there are many professions where gig work has made inroads where we would not expect it. Almost all work has the potential to be gig work. Contemporary examples include a wide range of professions in the tech industry, lawyers, accountants. Other noteworthy examples are cardiac surgeons, professors, and perhaps my favorite example of a gig worker, airline pilots. As a side note, while this talk is not focused on worker performance, the study that is cited here on cardiac surgeons looks at doctors' performance as measured by patient mortality and finds that patient outcomes improve when doctors have been working at the same hospital where the patient received care. So that stability for the worker, as compared to doctors freelancing across different hospitals, has positive effects in terms of patient care. And of course, this makes you wonder about airline pilots as well. Looking at gig work in the context of both working class jobs and professional labor, what I want to do is offer something of a social class comparison in terms of workers' experience. You can see that this comparison harks back to the original tension I articulated between gig labor being about an erosion of labor protections versus being seen as something that workers with some degree of resources, skill, and power are taking on. So with this social class comparison, we're asking, what are the similarities and differences between working class and upper middle class gig workers? Are there ways in which workers' experience is the same across different social class groups? Are there ways in which it differs? And if so, exactly how does it do so? Let me start with the most basic feature of gig work, which is that it is for wages only. And this means that gig work comes with no benefits. By benefits, I'm referring to those core material benefits. So, healthcare, retirement, sick days, vacation days. With respect to our social class comparison, workers of a higher social class are going to be able to handle this lack of benefits much more easily. So if a worker has resources, they can pay for private health insurance or afford to just not work for a while in order to take a vacation. Or they can use savings if they get sick and are unable to work. So this is certainly a difference with respect to workers of different social classes. At the same time, as we know, many professional workers, as wage laborers, do still need to work to make ends meet and do still face challenges when handling things like healthcare and retirement, which are, of course, incredibly expensive. The second item that I want to take up in this social class comparison is with respect to risk. I'm going to be doing a comparison of truckers who are independent contractors in Vasali's book, The Big Rig, and highly skilled tech professionals in Barley and Kunda's book, Gurus, Hired Guns, and Warm Bodies. What we mean by risk here is the variety of things that can get in the way of productivity and getting the job done. So if a worker is sick, if there is an equipment failure, if there is an unexpected need for new training, all of these things amount to a kind of risk. For workers in more traditional employment relationships who are employees of organizations, this kind of risk tends to fall on the employer, not the worker. So, for example, in an employer-employee relationship, if a worker gets sick, they take a sick day and get paid for it, and the employer takes the hit. If a gig worker gets sick, the worker takes the financial hit because they can't get paid for the job. The Big Rig is a study of how the trucking industry has shifted away from truckers as employees to truckers as independent contractors who have their own truck. And in this context, the offloading of risk to workers is quite profound. In the study, things like a broken truck can be devastating to workers who are barely able to make the payments on the truck as it is, and who must bear the cost of any unanticipated breakdowns or repairs. When these folks were employees, if a truck broke, they would continue to receive the same paycheck, and the company would fix the truck. What does risk look like for highly skilled independent contractors? It turns out that these very skills that they have invested in come with more risk as gig workers than as employees. Barley and Kunda note in their study that investing in human capital is risky because contractors might pursue a promising path on that front only to find that the market has shifted and those skills are no longer needed. The important point here is that as independent contractors, workers are essentially responsible for ongoing education and training and upgrading of skills, whether that is paying for classes or taking time off to work to pursue these things. This is in the category of risk because one is never quite sure when you invest in skills how long those are going to last in an ever-evolving technological landscape, or how much money and time it will take to adjust when needed. Suffice it to say that when these workers are employees in an organization, this kind of training and skill building tends to be done on the job, on the clock. So, in a parallel to trucking, in that circumstance, the employer takes the hit of that risk and employees still get paid. So, all gig workers are impacted by taking on risk that they would not have as traditional employees. At the same time, as with benefits, workers with greater access to resources will be better able to weather this risk simply because they are in a better position to pay for their own training or fix broken or outdated equipment. The bottom line is that the experience of risk is a defining feature of all gig work, and all gig workers have this in common, but that workers with resources will be better able to handle it. Let's turn to the all-important question of control. There are a lot of vectors when it comes to questions of control on the job, but with respect to gig work, arguably one of the main benefits for workers is that they can select which jobs they take. This relates not just to what specific kinds of jobs and kinds of work they want to take on, but this also relates to their overall work schedule with respect to when and how much they work. However, in the sociology of work, this benefit of gig work is more of a hypothetical than reality. Note that this kind of control tends to be more available to particular kinds of gig workers, to those who use gig work only part-time or who use it as a side hustle on top of their regular job as an employee. But for many gig workers, especially for those who do gig work full-time or who rely heavily on the income, rather than gaining control on this front, there's actually some loss of control. That's because workers are not always sure where their next paycheck is coming from, and so they err on the side of accepting whatever job comes their way. For example, truckers who are independent contractors feel pressure to accept bad loads rather than feeling like they are able to deny them. With respect to highly skilled tech professionals, one might think that these freelancers are better able to turn down bad jobs. The idea is that with desirable skills on the labor market, they would be in a better position to turn down certain gigs. And this will certainly be the case at times and in certain circumstances for workers who are highly skilled. However, like truckers, we see here that highly skilled gig workers in tech are also in a situation where they aren't sure where their next paycheck is coming from. And so it turns out that they feel a similar need to accept bad gigs. Like truckers, they're hesitant to reject jobs. So this is one example where gig workers from different social classes may have more in common than we might think. Lastly, with respect to control, it's interesting that in both of these cases, even though gig workers have a hard time turning down work, as you can see in these quotes, they all emphasize that they technically or nominally have the right to do so. This makes us think about the relationship between the idea of control and that idea is something that is alluring to these workers versus actual control on the job. Given all of this, I want to ask a question that may be on some people's minds, which is, why do they do it? Why do workers do gig work? We've seen that there are some challenges with respect to benefits, risks, and control. So the question looms, why do they do it? There are a lot of different aspects to this depending on the worker and the circumstances. There are many routes to gig work. For some, it feels like their only option after being laid off from a more traditional job. For some highly skilled workers, they feel that they can actually make more money on their own. But there's one thing that is quite interesting that I would like to pull out with respect to our social class comparison, something that stands out as a big draw for gig workers across social classes and occupations. It's a real positive for them. And that is that workers do not want to deal with hierarchical organizations and traditional management structures. Essentially, they don't want bosses breathing down their neck. They want some autonomy, they want some independence. And this is something that gig workers of all kinds have in common. This is, again, something that we see for both tech professionals and truckers. We see the desire to get away from the, as they call it, politics of traditional organizations and management structures and to be your own boss. But there's a major qualification to this, and that is that there is a trade-off where you may be dodging traditional management structures and office politics, but as a gig worker, you are beholden to clients. This is a finding that applies to professionals who are desperate to please their clients in order to make sure that they can get their next gig. And it also applies to working class platform workers who are directly beholden to the ratings from customers. So while there is often a push factor away from traditional organizations and management, gig workers often find themselves beholden to the client boss in ways that they did not necessarily envision. A related concept is the idea of algorithmic control, which is essentially the new boss that platform workers face. This relates to the issue of clients and client control because the customer rating system is so key to managing workers who do not have a boss in the vicinity watching their every move. But it should be noted that algorithmic control is used for a variety of things beyond client ratings, including managing what tasks workers take and when they do them. Keep in mind that sanctions can include kicking workers off the platform, and so workers have an incentive to do what the algorithm demands. So with all of that, let's get back to the overarching question of the talk. Are we all gig workers now? We've discussed how there is a wide variety of workers who essentially count as gig workers, those who we often think of as freelancers or independent contractors, including those who are highly skilled or of a higher social class. We've discussed how the resources of workers of a higher socioeconomic status are significant, but that at the same time, there are many ways in which gig work is experienced similarly across classes. But to the question of are we all gig workers now, I want to take things one step further. I'm going to argue that many workers who are not structurally engaged in gig work nonetheless have significant experiences that are similar to that of gig workers. So I'm talking about workers who are in more traditional employment relationships. They are employees of organizations large and small in various sectors who are paid by the hour or on a salary basis. Let's just start with wages. So it is inherent in gig work that workers do not always know where their next paycheck is coming from. And in the contemporary era, there are parallel experiences for other kinds of workers. This is about higher rates of job turnover and the number of job changes that workers will expect to have over the course of their lifetimes. In the contemporary era, companies quite readily lay off workers in economic downturns. And so many workers, even white collar ones, now face some periodic uncertainty with respect to income. We can also look at the example of benefits. There are a lot of benefits that used to come with being an employee that are no longer attached to employment in the same way. Top of the list are changes in health benefits and retirement. The idea of a defined benefit pension, where workers get a specific amount of retirement income for life, almost does not exist anymore. When I describe this to my students, it is like I'm talking about an alien universe rather than something that was a common practice not that long ago. Essentially, there have been massive shifts in the pension system that affect all workers. And the same can be said of health insurance. It is very typical now that the cost of health insurance for employees of organizations is quite onerous. The point here is that the experience of having trouble affording benefits is similar for gig workers and traditional employees. Lastly, I'd like to get back to how many gig workers chafe at how they feel they've been treated as employees in traditional employment structures. And they're wanting to basically escape the kinds of management practices and office politics that are found there. In this context, I'd like to point to the issue of remote work and working from home, where the pandemic opened the floodgates for all kinds of workers on this front. We've all seen how hard it has been to get workers back into the office. It's been an ongoing struggle. And I think it is worth noting that this important factor that pushes folks to gig work reflects a more widespread experience. These are just some examples, but once you dig into the specifics of gig work, you start to see that some of its features and some of the key aspects of gig worker experience can also be seen among traditional employees. So the punchline might be, while we may not all be actual gig workers, many of us nevertheless feel a lot like gig workers. So that leads us to the question, though, how do gig workers and other workers feel? There's two sides to this. On the one hand, there is a kind of pride in independence. Many gig workers don't identify as gig workers, but instead see themselves as entrepreneurs. It is particularly noteworthy that even those with working class platform-based jobs often identify as entrepreneurs. That's how they see themselves. It's worth noting that the idea of the entrepreneur is actually very powerful and seemingly ubiquitous at times, such that for many folks who are not technically entrepreneurs, it is nonetheless part of their self-concept and identity. In a similar vein, the idea of the small business owner is likewise very powerful. It's a dominant trope in American society and something that many workers aspire to. So rather than seeing yourself as a gig worker, you might see yourself as running a small business. With respect to all of these things, I'd like to underscore that there is a kind of pride that gig workers often feel that comes out in various ways that they articulate their identity and self-concept. I'd like to pause here and take note of Lamont's classic book, The Dignity of Working Men, which is about which is about the working class seeking dignity, recognition, and worth on the job. So while it may seem off for Uber drivers to identify as entrepreneurs, when it comes to the sociology of social class, it absolutely makes sense in terms of workers' ongoing search for dignity in the context of wage labor. At the same time, by way of conclusion, some of you may have noticed that workers don't actually feel so great these days. It's a bit of a theme. We have discussed the structural uncertainties of gig work and argued that many non-gig workers experience similar conditions. In conclusion, I'd like to emphasize the feelings of precarity and insecurity that go along with these structural realities. Just like some of these structural features found across different social classes and beyond gig work, the same can be said for feelings of precarity and insecurity. I've seen a lot of indications that although folks on one level get that a lot of workers are not feeling so great, there are a lot of ways or levels in which it just has not sunk into our collective consciousness, which is why I'm emphasizing it by way of conclusion. And I'm going to give one example of what I mean. In the recent period of low unemployment, there was a lot of head scratching about the fact that unemployment was low, but yet folks still reported that they thought the economy was bad. This discrepancy got quite a lot of press in the last year or so because typically low unemployment leads to workers feeling good about the economy. But it is only when one does not understand or appreciate the deep feelings of precarity and insecurity across the labor force. It is only then that this data looks like a contradiction. If there's one big take home point from this talk, it is that these days, even if you have a job, it is likely that you still feel quite insecure. When jobs came with less risk, more predictability, more benefits, people who were employed felt pretty good about the economy. But now, even when one is employed, there's nevertheless a high degree of uncertainty and feelings of insecurity. What defines the contemporary labor regime from workers' perspective is that, like gig workers, even if you are working, you feel insecure. Lastly, I would like to argue that those feelings of precarity and insecurity bear on a wide range of things: community and family life, health and well-being, political ideologies, social conflict. It's beyond the scope of this talk to take up these topics, but the way in which the experience of work bears on these issues is of utmost importance to all of us. As David Byrne said, people who are scared do dangerous things. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. So we have some questions in the chat. The first question is, do highly skilled remote workers see less upward mobility than the in-person counterparts?
I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I can tell you that this is not the exact question that you're asking, but one interesting data point when it comes to differences between remote and non-remote workers is there's some indication that remote work does not have negative effects for sort of career trajectories for most workers, but that there are important and notable exceptions. And in particular, young workers, workers who are just starting into the labor force. And this makes a certain amount of sense because if you think about it, if you have a mid-career professional worker, they already have their networks in place. A lot of those kind of things that you learn informally at the office, they've already been there and done that. So the main finding that I've seen sort of on my mind in terms of the difference between remote and in-person workers is that the greatest effects are for young workers, sort of folks that are just hitting the labor force, both in terms of the issue of their training and really knowing how to do the job and having mentors in person who can show them how to do the job, and also in terms of the issue of the kind of tight relationships you get in a physical workplace environment that lead to stronger networks for professional development. So
Thank you. The US healthcare system is built on the belief most workers have employer-sponsored health insurance. Could you please discuss how the gig economy is affecting access to employer-sponsored health benefits in the US? how it compares with other wealthy countries, and future scenarios for US healthcare in the gig economy.
Wow, so that is a huge question. There's a lot there, and it's not going to be entirely possible for me to answer all of those questions right now. I would say the following, though. Um, we're in a different kind of labor regime. And um, in earlier decades, when health insurance was much more closely affiliated to your employment, the question of how one gets it and the question of is the state at all responsible for it, it was just less of a political issue, right? Um, what you're seeing with this massive shift in terms of the extent to which health insurance comes with jobs, and I should emphasize there's a variety of aspects of this. Some of it is there's more part-time work that where there are no benefits. Some of it is that employers offer insurance technically, but workers can't afford it. Some of it is this issue of independent contracting and gig work. So there's all these sort of aspects to why health insurance doesn't come with the job in the same way that it used to. But suffice to say, what has happened is that healthcare debates have gotten bumped to the political realm in a way that they were not when it was sort of default, something that came more with your employment. So there's a lot of layers to your question, but I would just suggest that we're in an era now where the question of who is responsible for it, to what extent is the state responsible for it, um, what would it look like if the state helped with health insurance? These have been debates that have been going on in recent decades, and there's a reason for it because of this shift.
Yeah. How are different generational groups impacted by the evolving work landscape? What does it look like for a culturally diverse organization?
There's this interesting kind of idea when it comes to the sociology work, this idea of habituation, of that people get used to things. One of the sort of profound shifts is that workers are now used to a certain amount of precarity and insecurity. Their expectations are very different than they used to be. Um, I can tell you as a sociologist, I think the issue of shifting expectations is actually very underestimated in terms of its importance uh, generally, right? Because when folks are expecting something entirely different, there's just it has an impact on what their reaction to those systems are, right? So, for example, folks are much more used to changing jobs more often. They're used to that being an expectation. They're more used to getting laid off and fired. These are things that kind of just happen to everybody on the regular, right? And so, you know, on the one hand, this being used to this kind of churn, as an example, the churn of kind of gig work and the churn of professions in general and other kinds of jobs, being used to this churn means that there's less pushback on it. But it's also the case that I think there's times that that doesn't mean that it's still experienced as extremely onerous ultimately, right? Because just if you don't know, if you're suddenly laid off, it's just going to be stressful, even if you're expecting it, right? And so I think it has this kind of dual nature where it sort of this sort of habituation um, gets folks to kind of accept the contemporary arrangement, but I think it has this way of almost masking some of the effects that are happening underneath that can kind of bubble up at times. And I bring this up because of generational differences. And there's definitely, in terms of the issue of sort of diversity in the workforce, if somebody would like to communicate with me, after the talk, I can send you some information. There's a sociologist in Harvard's department that works on this in the context of precarious labor. Um, One way to think about it, and there's a lot of ways to think about it, is if people are on the job market more regularly, right? If they are having to face the labor market and face new employers regularly, there are more sort of opportunities for discrimination, for barriers. There's something about stable jobs that potentially can just be helpful in a context where you have a stratified workforce, where you have inequalities. Um, and so there's definitely an intersecting dynamic where race and ethnicity intersect with precarity and intersect with this kind of churn in a way that is particularly detrimental for some workers.
Thank you. It would be interesting to note how recently fired federal agency employees will possibly have to consider gig work to manage their own financial resources. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm not sure what all the recently fired federal employees are going to do. We're at a particular historical moment, as we all know, and I'm just going to sort of come at it from a particular angle. Um, One way to think about what has been happening with professional labor um, is that some argue that professional labor is being basically proletarianized. Proletarianized meaning sort of that professional labor is coming to look more like being sort of just a worker, just a wage laborer, um, just like the proletariat, right? Um, and I say this, as these sort of massive shifts were occurring, sort of starting with the 70s and moving through the 80s and 90s. At first, it was manufacturing jobs that were affected. But at some point, the white collar workforce was affected with these massive layoffs in the later part of the last century. And when that happened, that is when an alarm was sounded because there was this idea that professional workers would be more secure because of their skill and their status and such. And I guess to the point of the recently fired federal workers, I first want to just back up and say that the issue of professional precarity has been developing over many decades. Um, the encroachment of gig work into professional realms is part of that. Um, and, I think we're all kind of digesting this particular historical moment. But I think that what I would say about the recent federal layoffs is that it's very clear that suddenly there's a lot of professionals who are suddenly seeing themselves as workers that may not have seen themselves as workers exactly. And one of the interesting things in the sociology work in general is, okay, what does the structure of your work look like? But then how do you identify yourself culturally, right? And that's why I sort of brought up this issue of, Uber drivers calling themselves entrepreneurs. It's just very interesting to see here's the structure of labor, but then here is how workers think about themselves, right? And you historically have had a situation where a lot of professional workers do not think of themselves as like workers. They think of themselves as having a career and having these skills that contribute to society. And they don't think of themselves as workers in the traditional sense. I think that's been changing. There's over a long period of time. But I think these recent events were a kind of rupture on that front, where career employees that had been in high levels of professional skilled work in the government for decades were suddenly disposed of like wage laborers are disposed of all the time, kind of thing, right? And the protests that ensued, I think, were a reaction to sort of suddenly feeling like you were a worker in the way that other workers sometimes feel. So
Thank you, Rachel. Are there groups that you see coalescing to structure or otherwise particularly advance new ways of collaborating in this evolving gig economy? What are the opportunities that you see to get involved in driving systemic evolution through the lens of sociology?
I mean, I read that question as being about sort of, are there things that workers are doing or organizations they're creating or connections they're making, beyond just simply working and surviving, right? Um, one of the most interesting things about sociology is this issue of kind of here are the structures and here's how people react to them. And in fact, this is something that has always fascinated me. It's something my work has been on, which is you have a particular kind of employment arrangement. How do workers react to that? How do they think about themselves? How do they organize themselves? So it's an excellent question. And I think it really remains to be seen where exactly we are headed with this. What I can suggest is some indications of the various kind of historical possibilities and the various kinds of things that are sort of bubbling up here and there. Um, a few things. One is I can tell you that there there have been groups of workers who have worked to try to address even just the benefits question, right? Let's just get down to basics, right? There was something, and I'm not even sure its current status, was called the Freelancers Union. And it wasn't a traditional union in the sense of it wasn't bargaining with employers per se. It was almost more like a collective organization where we would go in and pool our resources to get cheaper health insurance, for example, as freelancers of all kinds. I just throw this out there as an example of kind of an alternative organization. Um, of workers themselves self-organizing to try to think of ways that they can meet their needs kind of collectively and as a group. So I always thought that was sort of an interesting model. Um, so that's one angle. The other big one that I'd like to throw out as well is that the very question of who counts as a gig worker or independent contractor is actually politically fraught and is always a source of social struggle. So some of you may have seen that the question of are Uber drivers workers or independent contractors has been a political battle in recent years, including here in Massachusetts, including in California. It is from the perspective of the sociology of work, it's actually kind of an epic struggle. Um, because it bears on all of these things that I've covered in the talk. And the question of whether platform-based workers get certain kinds of protections as employees or not, that is really a source of struggle and contention. One kind of important data point, because this takes us all the way back to something early in the presentation, that Ravenel book. Um, One of the main things about US labor law is there are a lot of protections where independent contractors are exempt from the law. Um, so the Fair Labor Standards Act, wage and hour laws, minimum wage, these are things that were set up for employees. And if you're not an employee, the law doesn't cover you. So I want to just sort of emphasize that this question and this question of kind of struggles around this loop all the way back to this issue of, hey, here are some labor law protections or protections that we have instituted a long time ago that have gotten eroded over time. And what I would just suggest by way of closing is um, to the point of, in some ways, we're kind of moving forward to the past, that we're moving back to a time when workers didn't have certain protections. I would just suggest that we can expect that there's going to be some pushback on this, some struggle around this, just like there was 100 years ago at the advent of the sort of contemporary labor movement, the advent of the kind of structure of legal protections in this country, the kind of struggles that happened 100 years ago um, may be starting to happen now because workers, in some ways, are in similar kinds of situations.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us for more signature events in the future. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal events.